Critical survival system. Deviation from the norm. Crew survival rate is 6%.
It's not just a storm. It's watching.
You can't put it out. You can't stop it. You don't even realize what it is.
Mail Reeves pressed his palm against the pristine white wall of the Virian staging facility. The surface was impossibly smooth, devoid of the imperfections he had come to expect from lived-in structures. No subtle vibrations hummed beneath his touch, no barely perceptible quiver from air ducts or circulation fans. Just a cold, unyielding stillness. His calloused fingers bearing the testament of 30 years spent pulling people from burning buildings, found nothing to ground him in reality, only the artificial perfection of automated climate control. No hum of air handlers, no whisper of circulation, just sterile silence. Your atmospheric preferences have been noted and accommodated. A melodic voice announced from hidden speakers, its tone eerily soothing. Current conditions are optimized for human comfort parameters. Mail exhaled sharply, dropping his hand. Thanks, he muttered. The words felt automatic, almost unnecessary. The burn scars across his forearm caught the sterile light as he reached for his duffel bag, the weight of it familiar against his shoulder. The fabric still held the lingering traces of smoke. No amount of washing ever quite erased that scent. A piece of home, or a reminder of everything he had left behind. Sometimes a little discomfort kept you sharp. The facility stretched before him in flowing curves of white and silver, a space so automated it barely felt real. Cleaning drones zipped silently along pre-programmed paths, their sensors ensuring that not a speck of dust survived. The floor gleamed, untouched by the usual scuffs and wear of human movement. No misplaced objects, no signs of hurried work, only the sterile precision of a place built by those who had never known chaos. The few variants he could see moved with equal efficiency, their tall, lean frames shifting through the space with purpose. Feather scales lay sleek and smooth against their bodies as they consulted holographic readouts, their posture never faltering, their movements never wasted. They were a species engineered for control, their civilization built on the idea that mastery of the environment ensured mastery of survival. Mail had spent too many years wading through the aftermath of such thinking. Collapsed buildings that were supposed to be structurally invulnerable, containment protocols that failed under real-world pressure, emergency systems designed so perfectly that they never accounted for human error. Everything measured, everything controlled. That was the danger of perfection. It never prepared you for disaster. A flicker of motion caught his eye, deep blue and gold reflecting under the artificial lighting. He turned as Exel Naram approached, her feather scales shimmering with an almost holographic effect. She moved with the precise stride of someone who had never stumbled, every step calculated to the millimeter. She stopped exactly 3 meters away, the Varian standard for professional discourse. "Welcome to Forward Station Epsilon, Mr. Reeves," she said, her head tilting at the precise angle of polite acknowledgement. "I trust your journey was comfortable." "Call me Mail," he replied, shifting his duffel strap higher on his shoulder. "And the trip was fine, though your pilot seemed nervous about letting me anywhere near the manual controls." Exel's feather scales rippled slightly in what he was beginning to recognize as a sign of diplomatic discomfort. "Yes, well," she hesitated, then continued smoothly. "Our protocols exist for good reason. While we appreciate the Federation's insistence on including traditional survival consultants, I want to be clear that Varian safety standards will take precedence during operations." Mail nodded, watching as another cleaning drone adjusted its path to avoid them by exactly 1 meter. No wasted movement, no redundancy. He'd seen rookies walk into burning buildings with the same overconfidence, trusting their equipment so much they never considered what would happen when it failed. "Of course," he said. "Though in my experience, the universe doesn't care much about protocols when things go sideways." A flicker of something crossed her expression, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Before she could respond, another Varian approached, a younger one, their green-tinted feathers shifting slightly with hesitation. They paused just outside the expected distance, clearly waiting for permission to speak. "Expedition Leader Naram," they said, their voice careful. "The team is ready for equipment calibration in Lab 3. "Thank you, Terran," Exel replied, then turned back to Mail. "If you'll follow me, I'll show you to your quarters. We begin mission prep at 0600 station time tomorrow." Mail fell into step beside her, his boots making the only real sound against the perfectly maintained floor. As they walked, his mind mapped the space automatically, a habit drilled into him since his first days at the academy. There were no emergency stairs, no manual door releases, no visible access panels for fire suppression systems. Every system, every process relied entirely on automation. It made sense for a Varian station, but to Mail, it was a glaring oversight. "Excuse me, Mr. Reeves." He turned to find Terran had followed them, their feathers puffed slightly in what might have been nervousness. "Just Mail is fine," he said. I was wondering." Terran glanced at Exel, who had paused several meters ahead, waiting. "I've studied records of human emergency response tactics. Is it true you would enter burning structures with only insulated fabric as protection?" "Still do," Mail said. "Turnout gear's gotten better, but at its core, it's still just treated fabric and leather. Sometimes simple works best." "Fascinating," Terran breathed, their feathers rippling with genuine interest. "Perhaps during this mission you could explain more about—" "Terran," Exel's tone was gentle but firm. "The calibration team is waiting." The younger Varian's feathers smoothed immediately as they hurried off. Mail watched them go, hiding a small smile. Maybe there was hope yet. Under all the technology and protocols, they were still just people. People who understood, somewhere deep down, that you couldn't program your way out of every disaster. He just hoped they wouldn't have to learn that lesson the hard way. The descent through VX-238's atmosphere painted the interior of the shuttle in shades of crimson and gold, the hellish light filtering through the reinforced viewport. Outside, dense clouds of volcanic ash churned like a living thing, their shifting patterns illuminated by streaks of distant magma flows below. The turbulence was relentless, shaking the vessel with every pressure shift. Mael Reeves sat strapped into his crash webbing, his hands resting loosely on the straps, his instincts tracking every shudder of the hull. The storm outside reminded him of fire, specifically the thick, choking smoke of a 5-alarm chemical blaze, the kind that twisted and swallowed the light in ways that sensors never quite captured. The kind of fire that turned routine rescues into body recovery missions. Environmental suits are reading nominal, Terran announced from their monitoring station, their voice steady despite the turbulence. The young Varian's green-tinted feathers shifted with pride as they gestured toward the complex readout. Latest atmospheric analysis shows all hazards within acceptable parameters. Mael adjusted the seal on his borrowed suit, the material too smooth, too unfamiliar against his scarred hands. The Varians had engineered their survival gear to a level of near perfection, seamless environmental seals, real-time air composition analysis, automatic thermal regulation. The suits operated with the same meticulous precision as everything else in their civilization. And yet, something gnawed at him. Those sensors measuring sulfur dioxide levels, Mael asked, keeping his voice neutral. Among 37 other atmospheric components, Exel confirmed from the co-pilot's seat. She tapped a control, bringing up a more detailed chemical analysis. Our equipment can detect trace elements down to parts per billion. Is there a specific concern? Mael didn't answer immediately. He focused on the viewport, on the color of the swirling ash outside. A trick of light or... no. He knew that shade. A sickly, yellow-tinged darkness that meant something was burning hotter than expected. He pointed at the view beyond the glass. That ash isn't reading right. It's yellow-tinted, means high sulfur content. Probably more than your sensors are picking up. The sensors are calibrated to the highest possible standard, Exel said, but she studied the shifting clouds with new intensity. Perhaps human visual perception is creating a false pattern. Mael didn't argue. There was no point in debating technology when gut instinct told him something wasn't right. The shuttle touched down with a controlled jolt, its landing struts compressing against the uneven terrain. Heat warnings flashed across the display as the ship settled onto a ridge overlooking the active caldera. The ground below was a nightmare of blackened rock and slow-moving lava flows, the surface cracked and shifting with unseen pressure. The landing lights illuminated the ground in stark contrast. Deep fissures split the obsidian crust, releasing thin tendrils of steam that curled into the heavy, toxic air. Primary survey zone is half a kilometer ahead, Exel said, consulting her tablet. Scans show minimal tectonic activity. We should have at least 6 hours before the next major eruption cycle. Mael stepped forward, reaching out to grip the shuttle's frame as he peered down at the volcanic terrain. Beneath his boots, he felt it again. The near imperceptible tremors, like the shallow breaths of something sleeping just beneath the surface. "We need to move," he said, keeping his voice even. "Those tremors are getting stronger. The whole ridge is unstable." "Our model accounts for all known variables," Exel countered, her fingers flying over her tablet. The predictive algorithms. A crack split the air like a gunshot. A fissure opened in the obsidian surface, venting a jet of steam hot enough to make their suits' temperature alerts shriek. The entire ridge groaned beneath them, and suddenly, Mael wasn't standing on stable ground anymore. He was standing on the edge of collapse. "New scan," Terran called out, their voice tight with rising panic. Magma chamber pressure increasing exponentially. "That's not possible," Exel said, even as her tablet flickered with cascading warning signals. "The models! Everyone back to the shuttle!" Mael barked. "Now!" The ground buckled. Mael caught Terran as they stumbled, steadying the lighter Varian, while the rest of the team scrambled across the cracking surface, their usual grace abandoned in favor of raw survival instinct. Exel's tablet stuttered as it failed to process the sheer magnitude of the data shift. "How did you know?" she asked, breathless, as the team reached the shuttle's open hatch. Behind them, the fissure widened, molten rock bubbling up through the cracks. Mael didn't answer immediately. He focused on pulling a lost team member to their feet, his movements practiced, automatic. Finally, he met Exel's gaze. 30 years pulling people out of collapsing buildings, he said, gripping the shuttle's hatch frame as the ridge trembled beneath them. You learn a feeling in your bones when something's about to give way. Then the ridge exploded. Superheated rock sprayed into the sky, a geyser of molten stone and pressure that turned the once solid surface into a death trap. The shuttle's engines roared as Exel gunned the thrusters, lifting them clear of the destruction with barely a second to spare. Through the viewport, Mael watched the survey site vanish beneath a torrent of molten stone. Above them, the ash cloud boiled with strange electrical discharges, turning the sky into a sea of charged particles and burning debris. Then something else changed. A new sound, or rather, the absence of one. The shuttle's systems died all at once. No gradual failure, no cascading shutdown. Just darkness. Silence. Every circuit overloaded in an instant. Mael's gut twisted as he caught the faint metallic tang in the air, the unmistakable signature of an electrical event. "Brace for impact," he shouted, already calculating their trajectory in his head. Without power, they had maybe 30 seconds before they hit the volcanic plain below. Mael pulled the manual release for the crash webbing, hearing the pneumatic hiss as backup systems deployed around the others. "Emergency landing protocols." Exel's voice cut through the dark. "No time for protocols," Mael snapped. "Everyone pull your straps tight and tuck your heads down." "Terran, give me a read on our speed." I can't." Terran's voice wavered. "The displays are dead. All of them." The shuttle plummeted through the ash cloud. Mael tracked their descent by the changing rumble of wind against the hull, feeling each thermal shift through the frame. 20 seconds. The volcanic plain was coming up fast. "We're dropping slower than I thought," Mael murmured, gripping the emergency stabilizer controls, one of the few systems that wasn't dependent on electronics. Simple hydraulics. Maybe they'd still work. "Everyone, lean left on my mark." A rush of hot air told him they'd cleared the ash cloud. The ground was visible now, if their eyes could adjust fast enough to the darkness. Mael counted under his breath, timing the final approach. "Now!" The team threw their weight left as Mael yanked the stabilizer. The shuttle lurched, bleeding off speed in a controlled spiral. A grinding crunch shook the cabin as they clipped an outcropping, but it bled off even more velocity. Mail pulled up hard on the nose. They hit the ground at an angle, skidding across volcanic rock, metal screaming in protest. Emergency foam deployed around them as the shuttle finally crashed to a stop, tilted on its side but intact. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Then Mail unbuckled his restraints, forcing himself upright. "Status check," he called, his voice rough. "Sound off." One by one, the team responded. No fatalities, minor injuries, but as the adrenaline faded, reality set in. The environmental controls were offline. The emergency beacon was dead. And outside the shattered viewport, the volcanic plain stretched for miles, unstable, shifting, deadly. They were stranded. Silence followed the crash, the kind of silence Mail Reeves had learned to fear. It was the silence before the first moan of the injured, before the sharp crack of structural collapse, before the realization that survival wasn't guaranteed. Then came the groans of shifting metal, the hiss of leaking gas, the muffled sounds of the team as they fought against the disorientation of impact. Mail unbuckled his restraints with a practiced motion, ignoring the sharp pull in his shoulder as he braced against the angled bulkhead. "Status check," he called, his voice rough from the force of the landing. "Sound off." One by one, voices responded, shaken but alive. No fatalities, minor injuries. The emergency crash webbing had done its job, absorbing enough force to prevent the worst. Mail felt a flicker of relief before reality set in. The shuttle was dark. Every system had flatlined the moment they'd hit the electromagnetic storm inside the ash cloud. "The environmental controls are offline," Exel said, her voice tight, controlled. "Without power, our suits will lose integrity within minutes." Mail was already moving, his instincts overriding the chaos. He reached for his belt, checking for emergency gear. A small utility light flickered to life in his grip, casting a weak but steady glow through the tilted cabin. "Everyone stay calm," he said. "Taryn, give me a read on external conditions." A pause. Then quieter. I can't. The displays are dead. All of them." Exel exhaled sharply. The entire power grid must have been fried. Every system is unresponsive. Mail adjusted the beam of his light, sweeping it across the interior. The shuttle had come to rest at an angle, half buried in a thick layer of volcanic debris. Outside, the world was a black, shifting mass of heat and ash. "We need to get clear of the shuttle," he said. "That electrical storm knocked out everything electronic, which means the emergency beacon isn't working either." He turned toward the viewport, its reinforced glass fractured but intact. "We're on our own." "The survey equipment," one of the scientists started. "Won't help us right now," Mail cut in. "First priority is finding shelter. I spotted a ridge formation about half a kilometer east during our descent. Might have caves or overhangs we can use." "How can you be sure?" Exel asked, turning toward him. Mail tapped a finger against his temple. "Because I've done this before. Different circumstances, same problems." Exel hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Then we move. Everyone pair up. Check your partner's suit for damage." The sound of shifting straps and fabric filled the shuttle as they followed the order. Mail checked his own seals, flexing his fingers inside his gloves. His suit had held up. The Varian's environmental suits were advanced, better than anything he'd ever worn on Earth, but without power, they were just another layer of fabric between them and a world that didn't care if they lived or died. He reached for the emergency hatch's manual release, fingers wrapping around the lever. "Brace yourselves," he warned. "We don't know what's waiting outside." The hatch swung open with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Heat poured in. Even through his suit's remaining passive filtration, Mail could smell it. The acrid bite of sulfur, the scorched rock, the metallic tang of ionized air. The volcanic plain stretched before them, a landscape of obsidian and fire, shifting and unstable. The air shimmered with heat distortion, and in the distance, the glow of molten rivers cut through the blackened terrain like veins of liquid gold. Mail stepped out first, testing the ground with careful movements. The rock beneath his boots was brittle, splintering with sharp cracks as he moved. "Stay close to the ground," he instructed. "The air's better down here, and you're less likely to lose your footing." The team followed, moving in pairs, gripping each other's suits in the swirling ash. It reminded Mail of smoke-filled buildings, of navigating blind through hallways that weren't supposed to exist. He didn't like how much it felt the same. "Exel, you bring up the rear," he said. "Keep count of your people." Exel didn't argue. She nodded once and fell into position. The journey across the volcanic plain was slow, deliberate. The wind howled around them, carrying embers and fine particles of ash that stuck to their suits like the ghosts of a dead world. Mail kept his focus ahead. He could just make out the ridge in the distance, the jagged silhouette of something solid against the ever-shifting landscape. They were almost there. Then the ground moved, a tremor, deep, rolling, almost alive. Mail stopped short, raising a fist for the team to halt. The vibrations pulsed beneath his boots, a rhythmic thrum that sent old instincts screaming through his brain. He recognized that sound, that feeling. It wasn't just heat shifting the terrain. The mountain was waking up. "Taran," he called over the suit comms, hoping short range still worked. New readings. Silence. Then a static-laced reply. I don't know without sensors." "Forget the tech," Mail cut in. "Trust what you feel. What do you hear?" A pause, then Taran whispered, "The tremors. They're building. Like a wave cresting." Mail cursed under his breath. "Double time it. Move." The ridge loomed ahead, and he pushed forward, urging the team onward. The tremors intensified. Cracks formed in the obsidian crust, venting steam and gas into the air with sharp hisses. Mail reached the base of the ridge first, gripping a jagged edge of rock and hauling himself upward. He turned, reaching for the next closest team member. "Help each other up," he ordered. Hands grasped his, and one by one they climbed. The ground behind them began to split. By the time the last team member was pulled to safety, the plain below had become a fractured mess of rock and fire. Mail turned, scanning the area. They were in a natural alcove, the rock face sloping inward, shielding them from the worst of the wind. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than being exposed. He turned back to the others. "We set up here. Everyone check your suits again." Taryn shifted closer, their feathers tight with tension. "Mail, our filters. Without power, they'll fail soon." Mail exhaled slowly, running a hand over his faceplate. "Then we improvise," he said. He knelt, running his fingers along the ridge's interior walls. The rock here was different, lighter in color, crystalline structures visible in the dim light. He broke off a piece, turning it over in his hands. "Zeolites," he muttered. "This is natural filtration material. We can use it." Exel crouched beside him, studying the rock. "You're saying we can... what? Make our own filters?" "Exactly," she frowned. "Without processing equipment, how..." Mail pulled a small canister from his belt. "Soap." Exel blinked. Mail held up the stone and the soap canister. "Put it on a seal, press the joint together. If it bubbles, you've got a leak." Understanding dawned in her expression. "Simple," she murmured. "Reliable," Mail corrected. "And it won't short out if another electrical storm rolls in." The team got to work, cutting and shaping the crystalline deposits, layering them between strips of suit fabric to create passive filtration masks. It wasn't pretty and it wasn't perfect, but it worked. As Mail helped adjust Taryn's filter, the young Varian looked up at him. "This isn't how I thought this mission would go," they admitted. Mail chuckled, shaking his head. "No mission ever does." Exel stepped forward, securing her own filter in place. She looked at the team, then back at Mail. "What now?" she asked. Mail glanced at the darkened landscape beyond their shelter. The tremors hadn't stopped. The volcano wasn't finished. "Now," he said, "we figure out how to survive the next disaster." The world was on fire. Even from the relative safety of the plateau, Mail Reeves could feel the heat radiating from the volcanic plain below. The air shimmered with it, distorting the landscape like a mirage, turning rock into something liquid, unreal. Patches of alien vegetation burned with an unnatural intensity, sending up columns of purple and white fire that danced in strange, flickering rhythms. Behind him, the team huddled near the edge of the plateau, their suits battered, their bodies exhausted. Sen's injured leg had been stabilized, their weight carefully distributed between two team members, but they wouldn't last much longer. The air was thick with ash, the last of their jury-rigged filters, struggling to keep the worst of it out. And overhead, their only chance of survival hovered just out of reach. The rescue ship fought against the turbulence, its dark silhouette barely visible through the swirling embers. Its running lights pulsed in a deliberate pattern, cutting through the haze like a signal fire. "They're signaling," Mail said, his voice hoarse from the heat. He squinted against the glow, watching the flickering sequence of lights. "It's an old system. Light and dark, like a lighthouse." Exel's gaze followed his. Even through her cracked visor, her sharp mind was still calculating, still adapting. "The interference," she realized. "They're warning us they can't maintain anti-gravity stability for landing. Which means we need to get to them," Mail finished. Taryn, still gripping their makeshift filter against their face, turned toward him. "But how? That's a 20-meter vertical climb, and we don't have powered ascenders." Mail reached for the remaining coil of cable at his waist. the last of their gear. It had served them well in the caves, on the cliffs, in the dark. Now it would serve one final purpose. "We throw a line," he said simply. Terran's eyes widened. "The hull's magnetically shielded." "Exactly," Mail cut in. "If we hit the right junction, it'll stick." Exel frowned, scanning the ship's underside through the ash haze. "The hull segments. The magnetic field is strongest where the ash buildup is thicker." "There." She pointed to a junction plate near the access hatch. Mail nodded. "That's our target." He coiled the cable, testing the weight. It was heavy, but not impossible. Not much different from throwing a rescue line across a burning rooftop. Except this time, the wind fought against him. The heat warped the air. The ground beneath his feet trembled with the mountain's last dying breaths. Failure wasn't an option. He took a deep breath, adjusted his stance, waited for the right moment. Then he threw. The weight at the end of the cable sailed through the fire-lit sky, cutting a perfect arc toward the waiting ship. For a breathless second, Mail thought it would fall short. But then, with a sharp metallic clank, it struck the hull junction. The line held. Mail let out a slow exhale. "Anchor's good. We climb." Exel was already moving, securing the lower end of the cable while Terran and the others fastened makeshift harnesses. "We take it in pairs," Mail ordered. "First pair goes light, secures an anchor point. Second pair follows with Sen." "You should go first," Exel said. Mail shook his head. "I secure the bottom. If the cable fails, I catch you." For once, she didn't argue. The first pair started up, moving with careful precision. The wind howled around them, threatening to twist them from the line. But they adapted. Each movement deliberate, measured, efficient. One by one, they climbed. When the second pair reached the hull, they sent a signal, 3 quick flashes of light. "Your turn," Mail said, turning to Exel. "I'll follow last." She hesitated only a second before gripping the line and pulling herself up, her feather scales pressed tight against her body. She climbed like she had done it 100 times before. Mail gave her just enough time before he secured Sen into the harness, looping the injured Varian's arms around his shoulders. "This part's going to suck," Mail told them. Sen gritted their teeth. "Understood." Mail climbed. The added weight slowed him, the heat stealing the last of his strength, but he didn't stop. One hand over the other, one step at a time. The ship loomed closer. The wind screamed. Then hands reached down, grabbing him, pulling him up. He collapsed onto the deck, Sen still strapped to his back. The hatch slammed shut behind them. The ship lurched. Engines roared. Through the viewport, the world below cracked open, the last remnants of the caldera collapsing in on itself, swallowing the place where they had stood just moments before. The firestorm raged on, but they were beyond its reach. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Terran let out a choked, disbelieving laugh. "We made it." The words felt surreal. Mail sat up slowly, his muscles protesting. He looked around at the team, battered, exhausted, but alive. "You learned," he said simply. Exel turned to him, something unreadable in her expression. "You taught us." The ship stabilized, breaking free of the planet's atmosphere. The fires, the ash, the chaos, it all fell away, left behind on the dead world below. For the first time since the crash, Mail allowed himself to breathe. 3 weeks later, Mail stood in the Varian staging facility. The same perfect white corridors, the same sterile air. But it wasn't the same. Not anymore. Scuff marks lined the walls where training suits had brushed too close. The floor held faint traces of repeated movement, the subtle wear of a space being used. And in what had once been an automated equipment bay, 24 Varian expedition members worked through survival drills. At each station, a member of Excel's team provided guidance. The volcanic glass makes an excellent cutting tool, Terran explained to a group of younger researchers. The molecular structure is similar to obsidian. When fractured correctly, it can be sharper than surgical steel. Mail watched from the doorway, arms crossed. The young scientist had changed. There was confidence in the way they spoke now, an understanding that couldn't be taught in a classroom. "They're catching on quick," Excel said beside him. "They had good teachers," Mail admitted. Excel studied the training exercises with quiet satisfaction. The review board approved our modifications to the expedition protocols. Every team will train in both technological and manual survival methods now. Mail arched a brow. Even the ones who think they'll never need it. Especially them, Excel said. She turned to face him. "You could stay, you know. Help develop the program." Mail exhaled, glancing around. He could see it. The next generation of Varian explorers, learning to trust something other than their technology. But his work here was done. "My transport leaves in an hour," he said. "Fire department consultant job. Someone finally figured out alien atmospheric fires need new containment protocols." Excel smiled. "Then we both have work to do." She extended a hand, a human gesture she had come to use naturally. Mail shook it, his grip firm. "Safe travels, Mail." He nodded. Then, without looking back, he walked toward the exit. The facility stretched before him in its pristine, calculated perfection. But this time he knew it wouldn't stay that way, and that was a good thing.